My name is Candace Miller, and I am an assistant professor of sociology at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. So, currently, I am an assistant professor of sociology at the University of North Carolina at Charlotte. But before this appointment, I was a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Research on Race and Ethnicity in Society and a visiting assistant professor in the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University. In 2019, I completed my PhD in sociology at the University of Virginia. And I would say that my research agenda is primarily driven by an interest in racial inequality as a factor that shapes and is shaped by the contemporary urban political economy. But as a sociologist, I'm not only concerned with material inequalities, I also examine the role that culture plays in the reproduction of longstanding racial disparities, with particular attention to contemporary urban processes as articulations of broader racialized meanings. I'm currently working on a book which examines these issues in the context of Detroit. But some other research that's either in progress or under review examines, for example, the spatial distribution of arts and cultural organizations across predominantly minority neighborhoods in US metropolitan areas. I also look at racial narratives in urban planning, and in a bit of a departure from my usual focus on urban processes, a new project examines how Black women's racialized and gendered experiences in the labor market shape the ways that they attempt to prepare their children for work. So, um, I've always been interested in understanding the causes and consequences of racial inequalities in access to resources. As I mentioned about when talking about my research, that looks like a lot of different things. But to that end, right, I've sort of explored lots of questions that think about how people make sense of broader economic processes, whether it's related to where they live, the types of resources and amenities in their communities, how they make sense of their experiences in the labor market, for instance, and how that shapes the conversations that they have with their children. And then how those conversations, for instance, shape the future of work, right? What future workers will do and how they will enter into the workforce. And so all of these questions are economic questions, right? They're questions about the economy, but they do look a little bit different because I am a sociologist. So my training is in sociology. My methodological approach is informed by sociological research that's come before my own. And so there is a lot of overlap, but it is quite distinct, I think, certainly in methods, but also in the ways in which I approach these economic questions. So I'm always thinking about the socio-historical development of what we see happening today. And so that's very sociological, right? I'm thinking about structure, certainly. I'm also thinking again about how people make sense of it, right? So I'm always attuned to how people are experiencing the economy, right, or economic processes. And so those are some of the things that really drove my interest in questions around economic processes, but certainly my approach is sociological, and I really appreciate the things that sociologists bring to these questions about the economy. Yeah, so I really have had the great fortune of working with several economists, particularly in my time at the O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs. But it can be a challenge to work across disciplines. I think this is true for all of us, no matter what our disciplinary background. I think when we do decide to work, with other folks from other disciplines, it can be a challenge. We all have our own conventions, and so it takes, I think, a great deal of intentionality to foster really great interdisciplinary collaborations. So I'll say that that's probably one challenge of being a sociologist working in economics. Um, as I mentioned before, I also employ mixed methods to address the questions that drive my research. And so I do incorporate as much as possible qualitative data And so that means that I talk to people about their experiences, or I go to spaces, their workplaces, their businesses, to observe them in action. And so that is something that I think is really distinct, that I bring as a sociologist to many of the questions that sociologists and economists have in common. But that can also be a challenge, because I think, back to the question about the disciplinary conventions, I think qualitative research is much more common in sociology, and so that can be a challenge to sort of move past, I think, um, some of the preconceived notions about what it is that qualitative researchers do, the types of data that we collect, and what we can derive, the information and knowledge that we can derive from that data. I happen to believe that qualitative data is as beneficial in informing policy as are other types of data. And I think, if we really want to understand how people experience some of the questions and the issues that we are all seeking to examine and address, then what better way than to talk to them about it, right? To really get into some of the nuanced understanding about how people experience, for instance, racial inequality in the labor market, how people experience a lack of access to particular types of resources. And so I'll say that sometimes that's a bit of a challenge to kind of talk through my research, particularly the qualitative components of it, with some of my collaborators and my colleagues in economics. One way that I think qualitative research, or qualitative data collection and analysis, has helped to get at some of the nuances that other types of data are not able to do, I think, is in the research that I did in Detroit. So, one of the things that I was interested in was understanding how small businesses fared in the context of urban redevelopment. So many researchers have thought about how contemporary processes of redevelopment shape residential landscapes, right? But we certainly didn't understand as much about how it shaped commercial landscapes. But in the process of doing that research and interviewing folks, going to businesses and hanging around for a while, right, to see how they interacted with their customers, if they got customers, how often, right? Um, Part of what also came out of that was just a general discussion about why they started their business. What was the motivation in the face of financial challenges? Why did they continue? Um, and I'd done, a fair amount of literature review, and much of what I'd seen in terms of motivations for why entrepreneurs go into business, right, had to do with economic factors, that they wanted to make money. They preferred that type of work over sort of more traditional forms of work where you might have a supervisor, for instance. But what I found talking to Black business owners in particular in Detroit was that there were so many non-economic factors that were shaping their decision to start the business and to stay in business. So many of the business owners that I spoke to were not profitable, right? Profitability wasn't anywhere in sight, right? I mean, they were just kind of scraping by, but they expressed things like wanting to create and maintain Black space in the context of what they felt like was an encroachment, right? With new people coming into the city, a new city leadership, right? Detroit was sort of transitioning from this, large Black city that was governed by Black people to something else. And a lot of the business owners felt like it was in part their duty to maintain these spaces where Black people could just exist, live, thrive, right, shop, and not face some of the barriers and challenges that they might in other businesses. They also saw themselves as anchors in the community. So, as there was development happening and neighborhood demographics were changing in some places, these businesses really felt like they had a role to play in anchoring the community, in making sure that it wasn't entirely swept away and replaced with new residents, new businesses. And perhaps most importantly, many of these businesses saw themselves as being in this role of mending the gap left in terms of the provision of social services by the local government and the state government. So some of these businesses operated as kind of informal warming centers in the winter, right? People who were housing insecure or otherwise didn't have a stable place to be in some of the harshest weather conditions were able to be in these businesses safe, right? They were passing out food to some, in some cases, certainly serving as these informal after school spots for students who and in communities that didn't have formal organizations. And so I think it's hard to get at that with the survey. It's hard to get at that with some other measures. I think in-depth qualitative interviews really were key at kind of getting at some of those motivations that are not really economic, right, but are really about community building. And so I think that's one really great example of how we can understand, what it is that many business owners are actually trying to do besides make a living, right? And it also helps us to think about really new and innovative ways of measuring business success. I think, certainly every business is not going to be profitable. It may take years and some may never become profitable, right? But if they are serving a really vital function in their community, then maybe there are ways that we can support businesses to do that. Or maybe we need to think about new categories, right? Or new ways of educating, you know, would be business owners about other alternative organizational types that they might that might better sort of fit their needs, right? So for instance, not for profit status, right? And so I think that's one really great example of how qualitative research actually helped to access information that we might not have otherwise had access to. So I ask questions that address issues in communities that I'm a part of. In many cases, I have very little social distance from the communities that I study. And what I mean by that is I share a lot of similarities with the members of the communities that I study. And I actually think that that's one of the strengths of my research. And I think it has served my research agenda well. I think it's allowed me to ask really interesting questions, I think, important questions that have far reaching implications. And if I'm thinking about my lived experience specifically and how that shaped my research, I think it's always really fascinating that many of the questions that are at the center of sociology and economics are questions and discussions that I've been listening in on as a kid when my parents and my grandparents and my aunts and uncles were talking about their experiences in the labor market, their experiences making ends meet, their experiences navigating the social world. And so it's so, I think, great now at this point in my career to be able to, you know, really tackle those questions with all of the resources that I've gotten along the way to the PhD. But they are questions that I know are important to people because I've heard folks talking about them right around the dinner table at the cookout, and so I think those questions that they were asking, those discussions that they were asking are the very same questions and discussions that I'm having with my research. And I think, that certainly has informed and shaped my research and my research agenda. And I think that that's really special. Any chance that I get to, I think, give a voice to folks who aren't typically in this space, who don't get a lot of opportunities to be in this space, really, I think, gives me a lot of energy to continue doing the work that I do. I think, allowing their insights to kind of speak through in the work that I do is really important. I think it gives a lot of great shape to my research. It makes it really fascinating. It makes it really cutting edge. And so I think, in the very best way, all of those conversations and all of those folks have certainly shaped my research. And that makes me really happy. So. Yeah, so my experiences as a Black woman have definitely shaped the research questions that I'm interested in and the methods that I use. I think, first, certainly relying on qualitative data, interviews, ethnography, observing people sort of navigating the world in their day to day lives is really informed by my experiences as a Black woman. I do, and I think I can't reiterate this enough, I do think it's so important to hear from people about their experiences. Um, I'm really reluctant to draw conclusions about um, people's the outcomes, many of the outcomes that I think we're all interested in, without hearing from the very people who are at the center of those questions. And I think this is so much of our social world could be probably understood better if we focused more on the experiences of Black women. We could learn a lot about our economy. We could learn a lot about our labor market, our education system, our criminal justice system. We could certainly learn, what it really means to make ends meet. We could learn so much if we focused on some of our most marginalized community members, and certainly Black women, I think, are at the center of that conversation. Um, I think in terms of the research questions, I'm always also interested in taking an intersectional approach to questions, right? So I care about racial inequality, but I understand that that is nuanced by gender, that is nuanced by sexuality, by class, by uh, ability. There's so many other intersecting identities that really shape people's experiences. And so I'm always also interested in understanding not just sort of one sort of layer, but several layers of how people experience the world. And so I guess I would just say that. And, there are certainly folks who I think articulate it better than me, but, at the heart of that is a Black feminist approach to social science, right? And so we can think about this in economics or sociology or other social sciences, but really centering the experiences of Black women and understanding how it is that they are sort of figuring things out and making it to the end of the day, to the end of the week, to the end of the month and the year, and sort of persisting and in many instances flourishing in spite of really real material constraints. I think some of the key to some of our most pressing questions is probably in examining how Black women are figuring it out and doing it in spite of some of these really pervasive and longstanding challenges. Yeah, so I think, though, again, I'm not an economist, I certainly do work with questions about the economy and I think other economic processes. Um, I think in general, some of the same challenges or barriers to access in economics are also pervasive in the academy more broadly, and in social science research, both in the academic world or applied. I think, certainly some of the parameters around the types of questions that folks can ask and the types of methods that folks can use can be prohibitive because I think, again, you know, one of the really fantastic things that happened for me was that I was given space to ask and address the questions that were of interest to me. And, I think that unfortunately that's not always the case. Sometimes when we ask questions that are about the communities to which we belong, people refer to it colloquially, I think, as navel gazing, right? And that's such a harmful and I think constraining way of thinking about research because, again, we can probably derive lots of answers to questions if we expand the groups and the methods that we use in order to answer those questions. And so I would definitely say that, in economics, but maybe in the social sciences more broadly or the academy more broadly, allowing folks to do the research that really sort of gets them interested in the project of research is one of the ways I think to make economics and other fields more inclusive. And I think, yeah, to that point, supporting folks in addressing the questions that are of interest to them and really giving space and an ear to people who are thinking through, especially early career researchers who are thinking through things. Maybe they haven't pulled all of the pieces together neatly, right? But they're interested in something because they're living in the same social world, right? That is, full of the same economic processes that we all are. And I think, some of the most innovative and creative questions have come from folks who are part of underrepresented groups in the academy. And so, yeah, to whatever extent the space can be created for folks to answer the questions that are meaningful to them, that are based in their lived experiences, that center groups who they are a part of or groups who they believe need to be focused on, right, is really the way to kind of support individuals from diverse backgrounds. I think the other thing, right, is funding. Graduate school is, I think, increasingly difficult too. I'm thinking ahead to, next year's cohort and the next couple of years cohorts, especially as we see the cost of living rising precipitously, right? I just think, there are so many challenges. There have been so many challenges to attending graduate school. I think, tapping out of the labor market for 5 or 6 years. um, People have different responsibilities, whether financial or time commitments. And so I think really also being intentional about um, thinking through the various challenges that adults of all walks of life have, and thinking about ways that graduate school can support people from many different experiences is also a way, I think, to invite more people into fields like economics, sociology, other social sciences, and the academy more broadly, because I do worry about future graduate students and their ability to fully participate in what I had the good fortune of having time to participate in. And because it is just I'm in Charlotte. It's the cost of living here is growing uh, so quickly, and it's becoming unmanageable. And I just I worry about some of the graduate students who I work with, and just thinking about folks' ability to really dedicate the time to graduate school that many of us have had the opportunity to given the rising costs. And so to the extent that we can really support students financially, I think that invites people from diverse backgrounds into the space as well, because that's such a prohibitive factor, I think, for so many people who would be wonderful researchers and really add to our knowledge, but just don't get the chance to because they simply can't afford it. So I think that's a real thing that we have to get real about, talking about the financial aspects of entering the academy. So I think opportunities that support individuals from diverse backgrounds to join and stay in economics and other social science disciplines like sociology, are programs that I think really seek to address some of the barriers and challenges that historically have been experienced by those groups. So I know several universities, including the University of Virginia, where I got my PhD, have programs that I think are really targeted at underrepresented students, whether it's to give them additional time to facilitate network building very early on in graduate school, so on campus, but also at external institutions. Um, I think, yeah, just assuming that folks are coming into the academy with no knowledge, right, about going to conferences, for instance, how to prepare an abstract to submit to a conference, how to apply for external funding. I think those kinds of programs that just, again, assume, right, that really kind of acknowledge there's a hidden curriculum and address it by giving the information to students directly, I think are great. Because I do think that, it's once you're at the faculty stage, you kind of have a good sense of what you need to be doing, what are the opportunities out there, what are the resources out there. And sometimes we take for granted that other folks know that information. And I know I was a first gen college student. And so, there were many things that I learned sort of, through listening to overhearing a conversation or, indirectly finding out about something that would have been really helpful for me to know earlier on in my career. And so I think programs that really just start from zero, assuming someone doesn't know anything about how to be a successful graduate student and then how to be a successful professional economist or sociologist, are really great. Because I do think that sometimes we don't know what we don't know. And so oftentimes students, I think, miss out on opportunities because they just simply don't know that those opportunities exist, that those are things that they can ask for, that there won't be any repercussions for asking about it. And so I think those are really important. Funding, again, I think that there have been some shifts in the types of funding that are available to underrepresented students. I was a Ford Fellow. That program is ending, unfortunately. And, those programs are wonderful because they provide the financial resources that students need, I think, to get projects done or to, devote time to their study rather than to perhaps teaching or other sort of time intensive things early in your career. But they also take a lot of time to apply for. And so I think, one of the questions that has come up with several of my colleagues is around, the kind of additional time that underrepresented students or students from diverse backgrounds spend on securing financial resources. And so I think to the extent that there can be some support there, or maybe there's a shift in the way that students apply for and access those resources, because it's great if you get them, but there's still, a time, a commitment associated with that. And so I think really thinking about the unique experiences of students from diverse backgrounds, the ways in which they spend their time differently because of some of these constraints, and the ways in which that may ultimately impact their productivity, for instance, early on, their ability to network. I think to the extent that we can also consider those things. And there's so much. The great thing is that there's so much research out there about underrepresented students' experiences. So I don't think it's a matter of the knowledge not being there, but I think we as faculty and programs more broadly really, I think, need to be intentional about engaging with that research to understand the ways that we can address the unique needs of students who backgrounds are underrepresented in the academy, or who, are diverse in other ways, so that, we can create a space, I think, where students are able to kind of do research, contribute to the discipline, both intellectually and in terms of engagement, and that they stay. Because that's the other thing, right? We don't want any leaky pipelines. We want folks to get in and to stay, because it is really important. I can speak a little bit about how I hope economics will change, but I guess I will say more broadly the social sciences. Um, I hope that there's more collaboration across disciplinary lines. So, as I mentioned, I've worked with economists. I continue to work with economists whom I've met, and I think some of the research that we're doing is really fantastic, precisely because we're asking questions from different disciplinary perspectives. And so I think the findings and the way that we're addressing these questions is far more comprehensive than it would be if we were just doing these research projects on our own. So I hope that there's more opportunity and more incentive for interdisciplinary collaborations across the social sciences. Um, and I think to that end, what I hope my peers will do in the near term is, yeah, make friends. I hope that there are ways in which we can. I think Equitable Growth is a really fantastic platform for this. For me as a sociologist, making connections with economists and being able to hear about the research questions that folks are working on, and thinking about ways that it's related to my own research and how I can, whether or not there are opportunities for for collaboration. But I hope that there are also other places where economists and sociologists in particular can come together to talk about some of the same questions, because I know that there's so much overlap. We see it when we read research. And I think there are things that economists have been doing that, and things in the economics literature that are, I think, super informative for my research. And so, being in contact and chatting with folks who are engaging with that literature and sharing those resources is really important. I'm always open to do the same for my colleagues in economics. But yeah, just really thinking and being intentional about collaborating more, I think is going to be important. And I think, sociologists have been concerned with questions of inequality, particularly how various social identities or social characteristics shape inequality. I think economists are certainly doing more of this work now than I think has historically been the case. But I also hope that that continues. I think those are ways that we can all sort of work together to improve the work that we're both doing on either side of the disciplinary line. And so, yeah, collaborations I think are really important. I think those are things that we can do in the short term and in the long term, and also creating spaces where we can come together to share that work. Equitable growth is a great example, but I hope that there are also more opportunities to do that, particularly between economists and sociologists.